Hello, this is episode 5 of my 8-foot tall Thanos costume build. In the last 4 episodes I've done pretty much everything from the waist up, so today I'm going to start on the thighs. If you're new to this channel, make sure you subscribe, hit the little notification bell and give this video a thumbs up too. Now let's get started. So we start out with the printouts of the parts. There's not too many to make up the thigh, which is pretty cool, although most of the parts are very big, so you can need a very big flat surface to lay all these pieces out, as a lot of them are printed over more than one page. Right, so now join up these pieces. Now I print mine on really crappy printer paper, and the reason I do that is because the really crappy stuff is quite thin, so you can easily see through the paper, which makes it easier to join up the parts that are printed on more than one piece, because Pepicure Designer prints little crosses in the corners and you just overlap those, so if you couldn't see through the paper that would be quite troublesome. So I recommend using really cheap rubbish paper for this. So let's do that with all the pieces and then cut them out with scissors. Now this piece here needs to be bent in more than one way, which you can't do with paper. So on the file it's got a dark cut down the middle of it, which is like a big V-shaped thing. You cut that out and then you join the part back up again. So I'm going to cut that V shape out. And I'm going to join that piece back up with some tape, making sure that the outside edge is really neat. What's going on in the middle, not really too fussed with. And that's not going to sit flat now, so lots of tape on that and squish it down will make that sit a bit flatter. Now some of these pieces I've stuck together, leaving a gap between them based on the measurements on the Pepicure file. Now pinning these down to some 10mm thick EVA foam. These are floor mats, and then drawing around these with the back of a knife. You could use a Sharpie if you want, but then you have to rub the Sharpie line out because that will eventually bleed through your paint, which would be a disaster. All this hard work and then it'll have all these lines over it. So I use the back of a knife. Once you've drawn around all of these, keep the templates because you need to flip them over so they're upside down, and then use those that way up to make the other leg. This piece here with those bits cut out of it, I've just joined that up as if it's one long line rather than cutting into it. And then the part that you cut out from that will be the bit that goes in there, rather than using the little pieces from the file. That way they fit perfectly as they're cut from the piece they're going to be stuck back into. So cutting out those tiny bits now. If it's a bit tight to get your big knife in there, it's always good to have a smaller bladed knife on hand as well. And as those parts have got to be set back, I glue across the top edge of that piece and then stick that in there about 1/3 of the way down. So there's that piece done. On to the next bit. Now the curved lines on this piece, which separate this into multiple pieces, are really close together, and I don't think I'll be able to cut a piece of foam thin enough. So I'm going to widen those ever so slightly and make that about 5mm. So make sure you've got a very sharp knife when you're cutting these bits out. You don't want it to drag through the foam and tear them, especially as you're cutting out some parts that are quite thin. And just as before, we're going to cut lots of little pieces out of this one big piece so they'll all stick back together perfectly. I've cut that corner piece out now, and now cutting about 5mm in from the edge. And then this piece, as well as the curvy pieces on the length of that, are going to be set back about 1/3 of the way, again using a bit of hot glue just along the top edge, then holding that in place until set. So doing the curvy pieces now. Now as the two main big pieces of this are on the same level, you can just hold them together on a flat surface like your table while the glue's setting. That way you know it's nice and straight. It wouldn't work obviously if this piece was already curved. Any excess glue that seeps out, just rub with your finger before it's fully set, and that'll get that off. And that's another piece done. Some parts need to be curved before they're stuck together, like this part here that goes on the front. So a little bit of heat on the back side only, because you don't want to burn the side that you're going to later paint, and then bend that into shape. Just be careful you don't burn yourself, because the foam does get really hot. The reason you heat form these before you glue them is because if you was to just bend them by hand and then glue them, then that seam is always going to be under some sort of tension. The foam's always going to try and pull itself back to its original shape, and eventually that seam will give way, especially if you put this part anywhere hot, like in the back of a car when you're driving it to an event, or if you're walking around and the sun's beaming down on you. That's going to soften the glue and the part's all going to bust open. So make sure you heat form them first, so that the two parts to be joined are pretty much touching before you put any glue on them. When you're heat forming parts that have already been stuck, say on one end like this piece, just be careful you don't heat the glue too much, because you're going to soften it and it'll fall apart. It's always best to take your time when gluing big pieces like this. If you glue the whole seam in one go, you're probably going to end up with the glue setting before you've held the whole thing into place. So I think about 4 to 5 inches is probably the limit on the length of a seam you can do with a glue gun. So just doing both sides of this piece here to get those lined up, and then you see in the middle there's a gap. So there's a piece missing from the file. That part isn't in the Pepicure file, so I've cut a little rectangle here, and I'm just going to glue that to the inside there to fill that gap in. You'll find if you build a lot of these Pepicure files that they are far from perfect. They are usually just a 3D model that wasn't intended to be made into a costume. So parts of it that you need to make it into a costume, or to make it as neat as you're going to want it as a real world, piece, are not going to be there. So sometimes you do have to kind of make it up as you go along. So now heating these parts to join them together. Now I try to make the final seam on this not the front, because the front part is going to be generally where people are going to be taking photos of this thing from, and it's hard to do the last seam, and it's usually not the neatest, so it's best to have that as hidden as you can. And I start by gluing one end of this just to hold it into place, and then pin the rest of it in, especially on a piece as big as this. And I'm putting these pins in a crisscross fashion. If you put them all in one direction, then they're likely to just pull out as the foam's trying to pull itself apart. So if you put one in diagonally left and then one next to it diagonally right, that's going to hold that in a lot better. Then using a really rough file on the inside there to remove the smooth texture of the foam, and some hot glue down the inside. Wait till that is fully dry and take out the pins from the outside, and then you're going to find that that seam isn't glued on the outside, so you're going to need to use hot glue on the outside of that seam. Again, only doing maybe 4 or 5 inches at a time, pressing the parts together. Some glue will most likely seep out. When it does, leave it a couple of seconds till it's cool enough to touch and just wipe that away. As you rub that, the heat from your finger will soften it some more and make it easier to get off. And then just gradually working up that seam until you've closed the entire thigh. Now onto the detail pieces. These parts need to be curved, so as before, heating those from the back and bending them into shape. And I'm going to push these two parts into shape so they join up perfectly. And there's a piece missing again from the file. That's because, and that part is a very thin rectangle of foam. This is about 5mm thick. And I'm going to glue that set back ever so slightly as I did before on those other parts. Only these parts are now curved, so I can't hold it against my table. So I'm just going to hold that with my hands as best I can, keeping that nice and straight. And that's that piece done. Now this part here, which is part of the knee area, is really fiddly, and some of these parts need bevels cut in them. So I hold the part that needs a bevel in it on the edge of my table and take a really sharp knife and cut a 45-degree angle in it. And then obviously if you line another piece up to that and glue it, that'll be set at 45 degrees. If you need a 90-degree angle, you're going to need to cut a bevel in both pieces. And then I gradually glued a little bit at a time with this, making sure I held each part into place until it was fully set. And as before, I had to cut out some extra pieces to fill in any gaps on the back there. A little bit of glue on the inside of that just to reinforce it. When I say a little, I mean a lot of glue on the inside of that just to reinforce it. And here's that thigh all finished. I've stuck those little detail bits on there as well, and this piece too. I've then heated the inside very carefully and just bent this into shape to get it to as close as the correct shape as I can get it. And I've of course done a second one, so we've got a left and a right thigh. You may notice though that the bit I made here, I haven't stuck on. They go underneath there. And the reason I haven't stuck those on is because the reference pictures I look at, it looks like this bit should actually be part of the shin rather than part of the thigh. So I'm not going to stick this on until I've made the shins, and then I'll decide where it should go. Maybe I'll stick this to the top of the shin and make a flatter version of this without the raised detail, just to fill in that gap there, and then the part of the shin will then sit on top of that perhaps. But I'll come to that when it comes to making this wearable. Also, in reference pictures I've looked at, there's no of that crisscrossy detail stuff on this as it is, like in the previous parts. Instead, there's an extra one of these stripe things here along here. That's not part of the model, but that'll be the bit that has the textured part on it. I could make another one of these and add that in, but I'm not going to do that until it comes to actually trying to put this all on, because that piece there might then get in the way and make it awkward to walk. So I'd rather not go through the effort of doing that and then having to cut it all off again. So I may add that in, I may not, depends on how comfortable it is to wear. But that won't be until I start making this wearable, and that's a little bit down the line yet, because we've got to make the shins next. So that's going to be episode 6. So make sure you subscribe to this channel to keep an eye out for that. And also be sure to check out the social media links in the description of this video. And be sure to check out my Patreon campaign as well. You can support all of my work on Patreon, so be sure to check that link out too, which is also in the description down below. And remember, you don't have to be great at making to make something great. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.